They say the people we trust most can become the ones we fear the most. That was Dr. Harold Shipman, a trusted doctor, a man who held the power to heal and destroy. His patients believed in him and relied on his kind smile and calming presence. But behind that mask of compassion lurked something sinister. Why would a man sworn to save lives turn into a cold-blooded killer? What drove Dr. Shipman, a trusted healer, to become Dr. Death? The background of the predator. Let's take you back to the 1970s when, in the quiet town of Hyde, Shipman had established himself as one of the most loved general practitioners around. People adored him, particularly the elderly. He could relate with them so deeply, so intimately, that he could feel their pains and concerns. Imagine going to your doctor, thinking you'd be receiving nothing but care, but instead, you'd be walking into a trap. And for some, it would be their last. It started innocently enough. Shipman was a good doctor, hard-working, dedicated man who always seemed to have time for his patients. But things began to change. He started arriving at odd hours and going to see his patients late in the evening. And then, he wouldn't wake you up again. Paint a scene. You are an old woman. You've seen Shipman for years. You trust him with your life. But one day, after the routine checkup, you feel sleepier than usual. You brush it off as old age catching up. Maybe a bad day, but it's not that. You slowly drift into unconsciousness because Dr. Shipman has just given you a lethal overdose of morphine. The drug meant to dull the ache of pain, but, in his hands, a weapon. I mean, old people die, do they not? It is life. That's what Shipman banked on, to hide behind the assumption that their time had simply come. As the bodies piled up, so did suspicions. It's the perfect crime, isn't it? Killing people who are going to die soon anyway. Nobody ever questions it. Not at first. But here is where things start getting suspicious. The families of his patients began noticing something odd. These weren't frail, dying people. These were grandparents, sure, but they were still active, still laughing with their grandkids one day and gone the next. Too fast, too sudden. It just didn't add up. You have to ask yourself, what kind of person can look in the face of a family and tell them straight-faced that their loved one died of natural causes, when he knows full well he's the one who made them go? And yet, Shipman did just that, over and over again. As the death toll increased, so did his arrogance. He started forging medical records, tampering with cause-of-death certificates, and even changing the wills of his patients. Imagine this. You go to your doctor for assistance, and instead, he doesn't just kill you, but he sees to it that after he has killed you, all your belongings go to him. You could almost see that he had calculated this out. Every move had been carefully planned, every document written to the finest of details to ensure that he was hidden at every turn. And it was good for a very long time. Too long. And now it wasn't just the patients who started dying in his care. It was the pattern became impossible to overlook. A family sitting at the dinner table trying to put the pieces together. Wait a second. Didn't Mrs. Brown see Shipman the day before she died? And wasn't he the last one with Mr. Harris too? People started talking. Families who had lost someone began to compare their notes. The pattern of Shipman became unmistakably apparent. But what do you do when the person responsible is a doctor? Someone you are taught to trust without question? That was when the police finally got involved. The whole case was opened for a full investigation, and soon enough, they started unearthing the nasty truth. Shipman was not just a doctor who just happened to have a lot of patients die. He was a cold, calculating murderer hiding behind the stethoscope and smiling. The police were insistent on digging deeper. They were able to find evidence linking him directly to the deaths. Errors in his medical records did not just appear. They indicated manipulation. He had been covering for years, making it seem that his patients were just unlucky or too old for their age. But the final nails in the coffin, the overdose of morphine. It came as a revelation that Shipman had been administering fatal doses of the drug to his patients, even going to their homes sometimes right after an innocuous visit. The chilling discovery. It's almost impossible to fathom, isn't it? A doctor who has sworn the oath to preserve life, to be the very one to take those lives. What is worse, he almost got away with it, for years. The turning point is when Shipman's intricate lying web is about to start crumbling, and the world finally understands him for what he really is: a cold, methodical murderer. Dozens had already died at the time anyone suspected something was amiss, certainly not peaceful or natural as Shipman had everyone imagine, but he was killing them one by one and gently forging all the documents to make such deaths seem a legitimate part of life. And now let's get into the ugly detail, worse than your worst imagination. Imagine when your dearly loved elderly parent or grandparent dies. The grief, the pain. But at least there's one person whom you definitely trust to guide you through it. Your family doctor, right? Harold Shipman played that role perfectly. When a patient died under his care, he was the first to show up, offering condolences and easing the family's mind. And then, when you thought he was a sympathetic and honest doctor, he'd start whispering changes into the entire process quietly. But that was not all. He didn't rely on people's grief and shock alone to cover up his crimes. No, he went much further. He started changing the death certificates and falsifying the medical records. He'd write things down like natural causes or heart attack, but the real cause would be lethal doses of morphine, injected by Shipman himself. And the worst thing here? Well, most of the families didn't even know. They thought that their loved one just passed quietly. Well, this is the kind of twisted, heartless manipulation that shows who Shipman was. He wasn't killing for the sake of killing. He was making a profit. Some of his victims were wealthy, elderly patients, and Shipman had a plan for when they died. He would forge their wills. Indeed, he altered documents in the records so that holy macaroni, Harold Shipman, their doctor, was suddenly a beneficiary. He used his power, his stature as a trusted doctor, to not only murder his patients, but to then steal from them afterward. Kathleen Grundy is an example. She was one of Shipman's richer patients, and like so many others, she trusted him totally. When she died, nobody thought twice about it. She was an aged woman, and Shipman had been looking after her for years. But when her family looked at her will later, they were shocked. She left nearly everything to Shipman. That was the moment the Grundy family knew something was wrong. This was no natural death. This was murder with a motive, and they weren't going to let it go unnoticed. The whole thing started going downhill for Shipman when Grundy's daughter reported the case to the authorities. The forged will was one of the most crucial pieces of real evidence that led to the full investigation. It started digging up his records, and what they found was more frightening than anyone had ever imagined. Evidence mounts. Police started examining case after case of Shipman and didn't have to wait long before the pattern began to emerge. A doctor's office keeps track of everything: medical histories, prescriptions, treatment plans. And Shipman? Well, he thought he'd covered his tracks, but the truth was hiding in plain sight. It was a disturbing trend investigators were just beginning to notice: an inordinately high number of deaths among his patients. Not just any patients, but elderly ones, most of whom had been in perfect health before they suddenly, inexplicably died after a visit from Shipman. But it wasn't just the number of deaths. It was how they were dying. There was a logic to the lunacy of Shipman. He'd visit his patients in their own homes when they were alone. He had with him a lethal dose of morphine. He had enough to kill them within minutes of administering it. To the outside world, it seemed like a kind home visit, a doctor taking that little bit of extra effort to care for his patients. In reality, it was murder, pure and simple. And here's the kicker. After the patients died, Shipman would immediately step in and issue a death certificate for natural causes or old age. He'd change medical records to make it appear like the patient had been deteriorating for months, maybe even years. But when police started digging around, they found something more damning: the overprescriptions of morphine, way overprescriptions. Shipman was prescribing this powerful drug in quantities much greater than what any of his patients would ever need. And then, cross-referencing those prescriptions with the deaths, it started to get clearer. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a premeditated murder. And now, finally, the truth began coming out. But this is where it hurts. Shipman was so pleased with himself and so full of himself that he didn't bother to hide most of this evidence. He left a trail of morphine, falsified records, and grieving families who knew something was wrong. It was only a matter of time before the whole house of cards came crashing down, But case after case, death after death, the evidence mounted until there was no way to get around it. Harold Shipman was no ordinary killer. He was a serial killer who had woven himself into the very fabric of his community in the middle-class town of Hyde. And no one suspected that one of the world's greatest killers was practicing his profession right under their noses for years. And now that the police had him, it was only a matter of time before he was brought to justice. The unmasking of Dr. Death. Isn't that wild? You'd think someone who murdered dozens of people, the likes of Harold Shipman, would be so slick at hiding his crimes. But, as with every criminal, his arrogance was his downfall. He thought he was above the law. But listen, the world has a way of catching up to people like Shipman, and when it did, well, it was vicious. So now the police needed evidence that could put Shipman behind bars for good. And that's when they move in. It was a gray, drizzly January afternoon in 1998. Harold Shipman had been bashed in and arrested at last. A man who walked around and went about his day, seemingly as though he hadn't killed 200 plus, yet in handcuffs. A man everybody called doctor, someone they trusted with their lives, is now to be charged with murder. Now, I know what you are thinking. Here's the thing. Even after his arrest, Shipman remained calm, didn't flinch, didn't panic. He thought he could fool everyone around. What an arrogant level. Even when all this evidence was against him, even when the police questioned him, he just sat there so calmly and coolly like it was another ordinary working day. The reasons why this case is sending goosebumps down my spine. No way. It was a crime of passion or desperate act. Shipping was smart and planned. Every move he made was cold and calculated. But the police weren't about to let him slip away. Not this time. Once he was in custody, they started going through everything. And then came the real shocker. You remember Kathleen Grundy, right? The wealthy woman whose will Shipman had forged? Well, her family insisted on an autopsy, and what they found was enough to send chills down your spine. Morphine, a lethal dose of morphine, right there in her system. This wasn't natural causes, this was murder. That was the turning point. Once they had the autopsy results, it was game over for Shipman. The police now had hard physical evidence linking him to the deaths. And not just one death, dozens. They started exhuming other bodies of his former patients, and over again, the same pattern emerged. Fatal doses of morphine, all pointing back to Shipman. The trial and the verdict. Now we have Harold Shipman sitting in a courtroom facing one of the biggest trials in British history. Can you imagine the tension? Families of the victims were there, sitting in those seats, waiting for answers, waiting for justice. The trial started in October 1999, and it was an absolute media frenzy. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How could a doctor, someone who had taken the Hippocratic Oath, commit such monstrous acts? Shipman, of course, pleaded not guilty. Of course, he did. He still believed, even with all the evidence, that he could walk away from this. The audacity, right? But the prosecution had built an airtight case. They presented everything: the forged wills, the altered medical records, the morphine overdoses. They even had experts come in and testify about the amounts of morphine found in the victims' bodies, amounts that no doctor could ever justify prescribing. And Shipman just sat there, stone-faced. No emotion, no remorse. Throughout the trial, the jury heard from family members, medical professionals, and police investigators. Story after story, victim after victim, they laid out just how deeply Shipman had betrayed his patients and their families. And it wasn't just about the deaths. He had robbed these people of their dignity, their peace. He had taken lives, but he had also shattered families, leaving them with endless questions and unimaginable grief. It took the jury 6 days to deliberate, and when they finally returned, the courtroom was silent. Everyone was holding their breath. And then the verdict: guilty. Harold Shipman was found guilty of murdering 15 of his patients, though everyone knew the real number was much, much higher. It was a victory, sure, but it was also a hollow one, because no verdict could bring back the lives he had stolen. No sentence could undo the damage he had done. But at least, finally, he was behind bars. At least, the families had some closure. The judge sentenced Shipman to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And even then, even after everything, Shipman refused to admit what he had done. He never once showed remorse, never explained. It was as if, in his mind, he still believed he had done nothing wrong. But that's the thing with people like Harold Shipman. They don't think like the rest of us. He was a cold-blooded killer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The aftermath. Now, even though Shipman was finally locked away, his story didn't end there. The impact of his crimes rippled through the entire medical community. People began to question how something like this could have happened. How could a man like Harold Shipman go undetected for so long? How could he kill over 200 people and no one notice? And so, the fallout began. The medical world had to take a long, hard look at itself. Laws were changed, and protocols were put in place. The way doctors handled prescriptions and death certificates was scrutinized like never before. Shipman had exploited the system, and now that system had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. But the scars were deep. For the families of Shipman's victims, the pain didn't end with his conviction. They were left to pick up the pieces, to live with the knowledge that someone they had trusted, someone they had welcomed into their homes, had betrayed them in the worst way possible. The final act of defiance. Harold Shipman, a man responsible for over 200 deaths, is sitting in his prison cell. His trial was over. His life as a free man was over. Justice, at least on paper, had been served. You'd think that's the end of the story, right? A convicted serial killer spends the rest of his life behind bars. But no, not with Harold Shipman. See, even after everything, he still wanted control. Even after all the lies, the deaths, and the pain he caused, Shipman still needed the final word. And he got it in the most shocking way possible. On January 13, 2004, just one day before his 58th birthday, Shipman hanged himself in his prison cell. That's right. The man known as Dr. Death took his own life, robbing his victims' families of the chance to see him live out his punishment. Can you even begin to imagine what that felt like for them? After everything they had been through, the trial, the guilty verdict, they were denied the one thing they thought they'd have, knowing that he would live the rest of his days behind bars, reflecting on the horror he caused. But no, Harold Shipman wasn't going to give anyone that satisfaction. He died on his terms. In a twisted way, it was like he was still in control, even at the end. And here's the part that stings. His death meant he took the truth with him. He never admitted to what he did, never showed a shred of remorse, never apologized. It's like, even in death, Shipman was still playing his cruel game, leaving everyone to wonder why. Why did he do it? What was the point of all those senseless deaths? We'll never know, because Harold Shipman made sure we wouldn't. In the wake of his suicide, there were so many unanswered questions. People wanted to understand. Was he mentally ill? Was there something in his past that drove him to kill? But Shipman, in his final act, made sure we'd never get those answers. He left behind nothing but devastation, grief, and a gaping hole where the truth should have been. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A man who spent his life stealing the lives of others ended up stealing his own, leaving us with only one certainty. Harold Shipman was a monster, and he took his secrets to the grave, a haunting legacy. Shipman's death might have been the end of his life, but it was far from the end of his story. His crimes had a profound impact, not just on his victims and their families, but on the entire medical profession. The legacy of what he did still haunts the healthcare system today, and the changes that followed in the wake of his arrest are proof of just how deep his betrayal went. People began to question their doctors in ways they never had before. Families started demanding second opinions, and healthcare protocols were completely overhauled. You know the saying, once bitten, twice shy? Well, the Shipman case left an entire nation hesitant to trust their medical providers. But even with all these changes, there's still an unsettling question that lingers. Could there be more out there? Could there be other doctors like Shipman lurking in the shadows, exploiting the very system designed to protect us? It's a terrifying thought, but it's one that we can't ignore. And the real horror here, not just what Harold Shipman did, but how easily he was able to do it. How easily he convinced everyone that he was their friend, their caregiver, their doctor. and how easily he took that trust and used it to destroy lives. Even after his death, that fear, that sense of betrayal, will always linger. Because Harold Shipman didn't just kill people, he killed something much bigger: our ability to trust. If this story left you speechless, just wait. There's more where that came from. So hit subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. What do you think about this chilling case? What could have driven Harold Shipman to commit such unspeakable acts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your theories. And if you're fascinated by stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping content. See you in the next video with another mind-blowing story. Curious why even the cops were terrified of this man? Watch the video to uncover the chilling truth behind his fearsome reputation.